You know, sometimes when I sit down to read you a story, I think to myself, when was the first story ever told? Was it a story of an epic hunt told by a primitive hunter? Did the story eventually evolve, and did the hunter create a cave drawing to further illustrate the point to his audience? Could this be the first use of instructional technology as we define it today? It is possible. You see, everything evolves over time. Even the definition of instructional or educational technology as we know it today has changed many times over the years to fit the current landscape. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey through time so you can better understand how instructional technology has evolved over time into what it is today. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Great. The year was 1900. Many students of various ages and grade levels gathered in a one-room schoolhouse sitting in rows of desks that face forward. There was a chalkboard at the front of the room. Oftentimes, students had a school slate at their desks where they could work on math problems, spelling, and other lessons with the ability to clean the slate easily. Many times, students had double desks and also shared books. Pencils and paper were also used in the classroom. Believe it or not, blackboards are still in many classrooms today. Then came the first forms of projection. First, oil lanterns were used, but then were replaced by electric projectors, which were much cheaper to operate. Slide projection was widely adopted and could still be found in some schools where Daddy works up until just a few short years ago. Around 1910, silent films were beginning to show up in education, and by 1920, the movie studios, government, and many other groups saw the market for films in education and rushed to produce product. By this time, there were now thousands of educational films available, and schools rushed to build up their catalog. To be a school with a large collection of films was very prestigious. The 1920s was where radio first started to find an audience. Radio was the way to reach the masses and began to take off as we entered the 1930s. This was the first form of distance education, but didn't work particularly well because it was difficult for an educational broadcast to line up with lessons being taught in a classroom, especially when schools were so spread out and there were not standard lessons being shared between the schools. In the 1940s, around the time of World War II, the US and the German governments began using films for both propaganda as well as the training of millions of people at a time. The US government was also testing to see what the instructional effectiveness of these training materials was. Filming techniques we still use in training videos today were created back at this time in history. Pretty cool, huh?
Cool.
In the 1950s, TV found its way into our classrooms and was also in many homes in the US.
So.
Yes, a show. TV shows. Funny to think, you have never even seen a show on TV. The only shows you have ever seen have been streaming from the internet. Population growth, lack of teachers, and lack of funding all provided a good landscape to allow ETV into our classrooms in the 1950s. The 1960s was the time of the cognitive revolution, and also when we are first introduced to your favorite show, Sesame Street.
Awesome.
Sesame Street was based on educational research about effective educational programs for children. By the late 1970s, Apple had gained some traction with its microcomputer and user-friendly desktop experience. Presentation software, word processing, and games were all at the fingertips of our students and teachers. In typical 80s fashion, it was a time of excess. We now had computers, cassette tapes and Walkman, CDs and Discman, VHS tape, beta tape, video players, video cameras, endless software programs, and the list just goes on and on. Film and radio have mostly fallen to the wayside inside our schools by this time. The 1990s was the World Wide Web. This is something that you have and will most likely take for granted as you were born in the year 2010. But I assure you, it was and is a pretty big deal. The internet connected the world and provided a pretty graphic user interface to explore it with.
Ooh.
Not so pretty by today's standards, of course. We've come a long way. We are now in the 2000s, the 21st century. Technology is expanding exponentially. It is now all about being connected to information anytime, anywhere. It's about collaboration and communication. The web itself has evolved into a very active environment, and we see the same evolution happening within the walls of our classrooms. We no longer want to sit in rows and be talked at by the sage on the stage. We want to be actively involved. We want to have discussions, and we need to be able to ask questions. Our schools are preparing our children for jobs that don't currently exist on technology that will be outdated by the time they exit our classrooms. This iPad, much like you, didn't even exist 2 years ago. And by the time you can understand all of the things I just told you, this iPad will be a relic.
Okay, Dada.
So the moral of the story is that we are in exponential times. Things are changing fast, and it's important to be able to adapt and be a global citizen and 21st century learner. So I leave you with this quote by Lamartine. History teaches everything, including the future. Good night, sweetheart.
Na, na,